Two men sit at the same negotiating table. The first carries more money than anyone else in the room, and he knows it with the quiet confidence of a man who has never needed another instrument. He pays, he buys, he leverages, he acquires, and he gets things done. By every visible measure, he is the most powerful person present. Yet there are doors in that building his money cannot open. There are people whose loyalty no sum he could offer would purchase, and results that no financial pressure can manufacture, regardless of how many zeros follow the first digit. He stands before these doors genuinely baffled, because in all his years of accumulation, no one ever told him that a second currency exists. The second man at the table has less money, measurably, verifiably less, but he carries something the first man cannot see, cannot quantify, and has never once thought to build. And every door in the building opens for him. Wallace Wattles called this invisible currency the true capital, and he taught, with the precision of a man who had mapped the territory completely, that it is the only currency that purchases what actually matters. The world teaches a single financial equation with the consistency of a catechism. More money equals more power. More power equals more freedom. More freedom equals more life. It is an equation that feels irrefutable because it contains enough truth to pass as the whole truth. Wallace Wattles does not dispute that money is useful. He wrote an entire science dedicated to its acquisition, and he wrote it without apology. But at the foundation of that science, before the methods and the mechanics, he identifies a category of value that money cannot reach, a domain of acquisition that sits entirely outside the jurisdiction of financial force. This is not a minor qualification. It is the cornerstone upon which his entire teaching rests. And to miss it is to misread everything he wrote. What money cannot purchase. Wattles names with precision the trust of people who have seen your character tested under pressure and chose to remain. The creative force of a mind that has learned to operate on the highest plane of generative thought. The compounding power of genuine contribution that returns multiplied from every direction in which it was sent. These are not soft ideals dressed in philosophical language. They are, in Wattles' teaching, the actual architecture of lasting wealth. The invisible capital that generates the visible kind long after every tactical money move has exhausted its leverage and run its course. The man who grasps this distinction has understood something that the wealthiest men in any room have often missed entirely. Consider what this means structurally. If the true capital is the generator of visible wealth, then the man who pursues visible wealth without first building the true capital is pursuing the output while ignoring the engine. He may acquire money through force, through timing, through the temporary advantage of circumstance, and many do. But the man who builds the invisible currency first finds that visible wealth becomes a natural consequence, a byproduct of a deeper creative principle he has learned to operate with mastery. Wattles is not offering a moral argument here. He is offering a causal one. The invisible currency is not the reward for good behavior. It is the mechanism by which the creative plane is accessed. And the man who accesses the creative plane does not compete for wealth. He generates it. What follows is not a survey of Wallace Wattles' thought, and it is not a commentary on his work from a comfortable distance. What follows is the precise revelation of the one invisible currency he identifies as the true capital behind every enduring fortune. The asset that cannot be taxed, cannot be inflated away, cannot be stolen by any shift in market conditions, and cannot be manufactured by any quantity of money alone, regardless of how skillfully that money is deployed. We will show you precisely what it is. We will show you the mechanism by which it is built. the compounding logic by which it accumulates, and the specific acquisitions it makes possible that lie permanently beyond the reach of financial capital. And we will show you why the man who possesses it in sufficient measure does not need to pursue wealth. Because the structural logic of the creative plane ensures that wealth pursues him. This is not a promise built on enthusiasm. It is a description of a principle that Wattles articulated with the confidence of a man who understood cause and effect at a level most economists never reach. The distinction between cash value and use value, between the competitive plane and the creative plane, between transactional thinking and generative force. These are not rhetorical devices. They are the operating laws of a system that has been in effect long before Wattles named it, and that will remain in effect long after this explanation concludes. The man who understands them gains access to a form of capital that has no ceiling. The man who does not will continue mistaking the instrument for the engine and wondering why the doors keep remaining closed. Remain with this, because what is about to be laid before you is the complete architecture of the only currency that compounds without limit, and the precise instruction drawn directly from the teaching of one of the most rigorous minds ever to study the science of wealth. For how to begin building it from this moment forward. The understanding alone is a form of capital. Let it accumulate. Wallace Wattles builds his entire system on a distinction that the overwhelming majority of people engaged in business, commerce, and the pursuit of wealth never encounter, not because it is obscure, but because the competitive plane on which they operate has no use for it, and therefore no vocabulary to name it. The distinction is this: cash value and use value are not the same thing, and the gap between them is the precise location where the true capital is generated or abandoned. Cash value is what a transaction costs, the price agreed upon, the number exchanged, the figure that satisfies the contract and closes the ledger. Use value is something categorically different. Use value is what the transaction actually delivers to the life of the person receiving it. The real, lived, experience benefit that arrives after the money has changed hands and the formal agreement has concluded. These two figures are almost never identical, and the direction of that difference, whether the use value exceeds the cash value or falls short of it, is, for Wattles, the single most consequential variable in the entire science of wealth. Most people, operating on the competitive plane, manage these two figures with the goal of equilibrium or, if possible, inversion. Charge the maximum the market will bear, deliver the minimum the contract demands, and call the surplus profit. This is the logic of competition. Extract more than you give, capture more than you create, and measure success by the gap between what you received and what you provided. Wattles does not moralize about this practice. He simply identifies it as the precise mechanism by which the true capital is prevented from forming. The man who manages cash value and use value toward extraction is not building anything. He is drawing down. Every transaction in which he delivers less use value than he receives in cash value is a withdrawal from an account he may not even know he possesses. And accounts that are only withdrawn from, regardless of how large they once were, eventually reach zero. Wattles' non-negotiable law, and he states it as a law, not as an aspiration, is this: always give more in use value than you take in cash value. The gap must always favor the recipient, not slightly, not occasionally, not when it is convenient or when the relationship is new and the impression matters. Always, and in every transaction, without exception and without calculation of immediate return. This instruction strikes most people who first encounter it as either impractical or naive, because the competitive plane has no frame for it. On the competitive plane, giving more than you receive is called a loss. On the creative plane, which is the only plane Wattles is addressing, giving more than you receive in cash value is the precise definition of a deposit into the true capital account. What makes this principle difficult to grasp is not its complexity. It is, in fact, remarkably simple. What makes it difficult is that its rewards are invisible in the short term, deferred in their arrival, and entirely outside the ledger that most people are watching. The man who delivers extraordinary use value today does not receive a receipt. He does not see an entry in a column. The person on the other side of the transaction experiences something, a quality, a depth, a genuine benefit that exceeded what they expected and what they paid for. But that experience does not immediately translate into a visible return for the giver. This delay is precisely why most people abandon the practice. They try it once or twice, and when the ledger does not immediately reflect the surplus they gave, they conclude that Wattles was wrong, or that the principle applies to others but not to their industry, their market, their circumstances. They return to the even exchange and wonder why the ceiling holds. But consider what is actually happening in that interval of invisibility. The person who received extraordinary use value has had an experience, not merely a transaction, an experience. They received more than they expected, more than the agreement required, more than the world typically gives. This experience does something in them that a standard transaction never does. It registers as remarkable. And the remarkable has a natural compulsion to be communicated. People do not tell others about adequate exchanges. They do not describe standard deliveries at dinner tables and over coffee. They describe the extraordinary. They communicate the surplus, and every time they do, the man who created that surplus receives something no money could have purchased. The testimony of an independent witness vouching for a quality of character and creative force that transcends the transaction itself. This is the first mechanism by which the true capital compounds. There is a second mechanism operating simultaneously, one that is deeper and in some ways more consequential. The consistent practice of delivering more use value than cash value does not only affect the recipients of that surplus, it affects the man delivering it. Every act of genuine over-delivery is, at the same time, an act of creative assertion, a declaration made in the material world that this man operates from the creative plane. And the creative plane, Wattles teaches, is not merely a metaphor for a generative mindset. It is an actual operative level of engagement with what he calls the thinking stuff of the universe. The formless substance from which all visible wealth is precipitated into form. The man who consistently acts from this level does not merely build a reputation for generosity. He trains his own mind to operate in the mode of creation rather than extraction. And this training is itself a form of capital whose value cannot be calculated in any conventional currency. Now consider the question of trust. Because trust is not a soft concept in Wattles' framework. Trust is an economic force. It is the lubricant of every high-value exchange, the prerequisite for every significant partnership, and the single variable that determines whether a relationship remains transactional or becomes generative. The man who consistently delivers more use value than cash value is building trust in the most durable way that trust can be built, through demonstrated behavior, repeated across time, across varying conditions, and without visible incentive for excess. This kind of trust is categorically different from the trust that is manufactured by marketing, by appearances, or by the strategic management of impression. It is earned trust, the kind that survives a crisis rather than dissolving in one. And Wattles identifies it as one of the primary stores of value in the true capital account. What does it mean concretely for trust to function as capital? It means that the man who has built it possesses a resource that converts into material advantage through channels that are entirely invisible to the man who has not built it. When an opportunity of significant value becomes available, a contract, a partnership, an access, an introduction, the person controlling that opportunity does not offer it to the highest bidder. They offer it to the person they trust, not the person they like, not the person they have known longest, not the person with the most impressive credentials, but the person whose track record of delivering genuine use value has demonstrated, beyond the need for argument, that the opportunity will be handled with the same quality of creative intention that characterized every previous engagement. The man with money and no trust stands outside that door. The man with true capital is already inside. The depth of this principle extends further still into the domain of what Wattles calls the creative thought that must precede the delivery of extraordinary use value. The man who is committed to giving more use value than cash value cannot execute that commitment mechanically. He cannot simply work harder within the same frame and expect the surplus to appear. He must think creatively, must look at each person, each situation, each exchange with the question, what additional value, beyond what was asked, beyond what was contracted, beyond what the market expects, can I introduce here? This question is itself a creative force. It directs the mind toward generative rather than extractive thinking. And generative thinking, practiced consistently, produces a quality of perception that competitive thinkers do not possess. The man on the creative plane sees opportunities that are invisible to the man on the competitive plane, precisely because his mind has been trained to look for what can be created rather than what can be captured. There is a structural reason why the use-value principle has no ceiling, and it is important to understand it clearly. Cash value is constrained by market conditions, by what the current supply and demand equation will bear, by the negotiating leverage available at any given moment. These are finite forces operating within finite constraints. Use value, by contrast, is constrained only by the creative capacity of the man delivering it. And creative capacity, unlike financial capital, does not deplete when it is spent. It develops. It compounds. The man who has spent years finding new ways to deliver extraordinary use value does not find the practice becoming harder with time. He finds it becoming more natural, more efficient, and more generative. Because the creative faculty, like every genuine faculty, grows stronger through exercise and weaker through neglect. This is why Wattles can state with confidence that the true capital has no upper limit. Its only boundary is the creative development of the mind that generates it. Consider, too, the difference in the emotional and psychological experience of the man who operates from this principle versus the man who does not. The man on the competitive plane is always in a posture of defense, defending his margin, protecting his advantage, preventing others from gaining the position he holds. This posture is exhausting, and it is epistemically distorting. It causes a man to see every other person as a potential competitor, every transaction as a potential threat, every relationship as a variable to be managed for maximum extraction. This is not merely unpleasant to live in. It is actively destructive of the conditions in which true capital can form, and the man on the creative plane experiences something categorically different. Every person is a potential recipient of value. Every transaction is an opportunity for surplus. Every relationship is a channel through which the invisible currency can be deposited and eventually compounded. This difference in orientation is not a personality trait. It is the direct consequence of the plane on which a man has chosen to operate. The word chosen in that previous construction deserves attention, because Wattles is unambiguous on this point. The movement from the competitive plane to the creative plane is a matter of volition, not circumstance. It is not available only to men with certain advantages, certain starting positions, or certain kinds of markets. The creative plane is available to every man at every point in his development, precisely because it is not a function of external conditions, but of internal orientation. The man who delivers more use value than cash value in a small transaction, on a small stage, with modest resources, is on the creative plane, just as surely as the man who does the same on the grandest scale. And the true capital he builds is just as real, just as compounding, and just as capable of generating the visible wealth that follows inevitably from the invisible currency that precedes it. What prevents most men from making this choice is not ignorance of the principle, though that ignorance is common enough, but a deeper, more persistent confusion about what security actually is. The competitive man believes that security comes from holding more than others. More money, more leverage, more contractual protection. He is afraid to give surplus because surplus looks like loss, and loss feels like vulnerability. But Wattles' teaching reveals the precise inversion of this logic. The man on the competitive plane is never truly secure, because everything he has can be matched, exceeded, or captured by another competitor with greater force. The man on the creative plane cannot be competed with, because he is not playing a zero-sum game. His wealth is not captured from a limited supply. It is generated from a formless abundance. And a man whose wealth is generated, rather than captured, has a form of security that no competitive force can threaten. This is the foundation of the true capital. And it must be understood as a foundation before the mechanics of its accumulation can be grasped. The use-value principle is not a tactic. It is not a customer retention strategy, not a brand differentiation technique, not a long-term investment in goodwill. It is a metaphysical operating law. The precise mechanism by which a man aligns himself with the creative force of the universe and begins to receive from it in proportion to what he has given into it. Wattles was not writing about business strategy. He was writing about the nature of creative law and the specific human behavior that either complies with that law or violates it. The distinction between cash value and use value is, at its deepest level, the distinction between the man who understands this law and the man who does not. To deliver more use value than cash value, always and without exception, is to place oneself in continuous alignment with the creative force that Wattles identifies as the source of all genuine wealth. It is to become, in his precise language, an advancing man, one who creates more than he consumes, who generates more than he extracts, who leaves every person, every situation, and every exchange in better condition than he found it. This is not a description of virtue. It is a description of the only sustainable engine of compounding invisible capital that has ever been identified, and the man who operates it consistently, who does not abandon the practice when the ledger fails to show immediate return, who trusts the creative law the way a physicist trusts gravity, will find, not as a hope, but as a structural inevitability, that the true capital accumulates, and that everything which money cannot purchase begins to arrive. There is a question that Wattles' teaching eventually forces into the open, and it is a question that most people have never permitted themselves to ask with genuine honesty. If money is so powerful, why are there things it consistently fails to purchase? This is not a question about the limits of personal wealth, about men who simply did not have enough. It is a question about the structural limits of money as an instrument of acquisition, regardless of quantity. Because the evidence is abundant and it is ancient. Men of extraordinary financial power have stood before certain doors and found them permanently closed, not because the price was too high, but because the currency they were offering was not the one the door required. What Wattles establishes, and this is the unshakable logic that underpins the entire concept of the true capital, is that these closed doors are not arbitrary. They are closed by a law, and a law, by definition, operates with perfect consistency. The law Wattles identifies is the law of creative force, and it is grounded in a distinction that runs deeper than economics, deeper than business philosophy, and deeper than what most people have been trained to consider when they think about the nature of wealth. The distinction is between a world of fixed substance and a world of creative possibility. The competitive plane assumes the former. Wealth is a fixed quantity, distributed unevenly, and the acquisition of it requires capturing what others have, or preventing others from capturing what you have. This assumption is so deeply embedded in ordinary economic thinking that most people do not recognize it as an assumption at all. They take it as the nature of reality. Wattles challenges this at the root. He teaches, drawing on what he understood as the deepest metaphysical reality, that the substance from which all wealth is formed is not fixed, not limited, and not subject to the zero-sum constraints of competitive capture. It is formless, abundant, and responsive to the creative thought of the man who learns to direct it. This is not mysticism dressed in financial language. It is, in Wattles' framing, the precise description of how creative force operates in the material world. The man who thinks on the creative plane, who directs his mental force toward the generation of new value rather than the capture of existing value, is engaging with this formless substance in the only mode that produces genuine and lasting wealth. The man who thinks on the competitive plane is attempting to work within a self-imposed constraint of scarcity, and his results will always reflect that constraint. He may accumulate money, he may accumulate significant money, but he will never accumulate the true capital, because the true capital is generated exclusively by creative force, and creative force operates only on the creative plane. The two are not interchangeable. They are not even adjacent. They are the products of categorically different modes of engagement with the fundamental nature of reality. To understand why this logic is unshakable, consider what happens at the moment of genuine over-delivery. At the precise instant when a man gives more use value than the transaction required. What occurred in that moment? New value was introduced into the world. Value that did not exist before the man created it. A quality of experience, a depth of benefit, a surplus of genuine care and creative intelligence was brought into form where there was none before. This is not a transfer. It is not a redistribution. It is creation. The appearance of something from a state of lesser being. And Wattles teaches, with the confidence of a principle rather than a hypothesis, that the universe is structured to respond to creation. The creative act does not go unregistered in the formless substance of reality. It generates a response, not metaphorically, not eventually, not under ideal conditions, but by the operation of a law as consistent as any law in the physical sciences. The response is the compounding of the invisible currency. There is a specific modern failure that Wattles anticipated with remarkable precision, and it is worth identifying by name, because its diagnosis is itself a revelation. The defining condition of contemporary economic life is what might be called the illusion of transactional sufficiency, the belief that a fair exchange, one in which both parties receive exactly what the agreement specified, is the highest form of economic relationship available. This belief is not merely insufficient by Wattles' standard. It is, in his analysis, the precise ceiling beneath which the overwhelming majority of people spend their entire lives, never understanding why the accumulation of money does not produce the quality of life, the quality of relationship, or the quality of creative freedom they imagined it would. They have everything the transaction promised, and they have nothing the true capital purchases. Wattles identified this failure with the precision of a diagnostician long before the transaction became the governing metaphor of an entire civilization. The surgical answer Wattles offers to this condition is not a new technique or a revised strategy. It is a fundamental reorientation of the operating plane. The man trapped at the ceiling of transactional sufficiency does not need to work harder, negotiate better, or accumulate more. He needs to move from the competitive plane to the creative plane. And the movement begins not with action, but with thought. Specifically, with the thought that every exchange is an opportunity for creative surplus, and that the surplus is not a sacrifice, but an investment in an invisible account, whose returns operate beyond the range of any instrument designed to measure the competitive plane. This thought, held consistently and translated into consistent action, is the beginning of the true capital. And the beginning of the true capital is the beginning of access to everything that money has never been able to purchase. The compounding logic of the creative plane deserves its own close examination, because it operates differently from the compounding logic most people understand. Financial compounding is a mathematical function. A principal grows by a percentage over time. The compound interest of true capital is not mathematical in this conventional sense. It is relational and reputational, which means it is non-linear and, in principle, unlimited. Every act of genuine over-delivery creates a wave of effect that expands outward through the network of human relationships in ways that cannot be precisely calculated, but can be reliably depended upon. The person who received extraordinary use value tells others. Those others enter into exchanges with the man who created that surplus. They too receive more than expected. They tell others. The wave expands. And the source of the wave, the man who initiated the first act of over-delivery, receives from directions he never targeted, from channels he never opened, from people he never approached. This is not a description of a marketing strategy. It is a description of how creative force propagates through human social reality. But the compounding is not only external. There is an internal compounding that is, in many ways, more foundational than the external kind. Every act of creative over-delivery reinforces in the mind of the man performing it the reality of his own creative capacity. He has demonstrated to himself, through action in the material world, that he is capable of generating value beyond what was demanded of him. This demonstration builds what Wattles might call a mental form, an inner image of himself as a creative force, not a competitive instrument. And mental forms, once established through repeated action, begin to govern perception. The man who has repeatedly demonstrated his own creative capacity begins to see opportunities that his previous competitive mind could not perceive. He begins to attract people who recognize that creative quality, because like attracts like at the level of creative force, just as it does at every other level of natural law. The internal compounding fuels the external, and the external confirms the internal, and the cycle accelerates in a direction that has no ceiling, because neither creativity nor trust has a natural upper limit. This is why Wattles can speak about the advancing man. The man who is always increasing in capacity, always expanding in creative force, always building more true capital than the previous period produced. As the natural state of a man who has aligned himself with the creative law, the advancing man does not experience diminishing returns because he is not operating on a fixed resource. He is operating on a creative faculty that grows through use. His true capital does not plateau after a certain level of accumulation. It accelerates, and the acceleration is the structural consequence not of luck or exceptional talent, but of the simple, consistent, unbroken practice of giving more use value than cash value in every exchange, across every relationship, through every medium available to him. Consider the quality of attention that is required to execute this practice with genuine consistency. The man committed to delivering extraordinary use value cannot perform this commitment superficially. He must actually attend to the person across from him, must actually seek to understand what that person needs. What would genuinely serve their life? What quality of value would exceed their expectation in ways they could not have anticipated but immediately recognize as real? This quality of attention is itself a form of generative force. It is the opposite of the inward, extractive attention of the competitive mind, which attends to others only to calculate what can be obtained from them. The creative attention is outward and giving, and this posture, practiced at scale and over time, transforms not only relationships and transactions, but the entire quality of a man's engagement with the world. He becomes, in the most precise sense of the word, a creative presence. Someone whose arrival in any situation tends to produce more value than was present before he entered it. The man who becomes a creative presence does not need to pursue opportunities. He needs only to maintain the quality of creative force that makes him indispensable to the situations that naturally seek him out. This is the inversion of the competitive posture that most people never manage to achieve. Not because it requires exceptional intelligence or rare gifts, but because it requires the abandonment of the one assumption most people are most reluctant to release. The assumption that security comes from holding, not from giving. Wattles dismantles this assumption not with argument alone, but with the structural logic of the creative law. The man who holds on the competitive plane is competing for a share of a fixed supply, and the fixed supply can always be contested. The man who gives, who consistently creates surplus use value and releases it into the world without attachment to the specific return, is drawing from an inexhaustible source and sending his creative force into a network of human reality, where it compounds according to laws that no competitive force can interrupt or reverse. The final element of the unshakable logic is this: the true capital, once built to a sufficient level, creates conditions that make its own further accumulation inevitable. This is perhaps the most profound structural feature of Wattles' teaching on invisible currency. At a certain threshold of accumulated trust, reputation, and demonstrated creative force, the man who possesses the true capital does not need to initiate every opportunity. Opportunities arrive at him, already structured in his favor, from people who have either directly experienced his creative surplus or have received the testimony of those who have. He occupies, without effort, the position that the competitive man spends enormous force trying to reach. The position of being sought rather than seeking. And the man who is sought brings his own terms to the exchange, not because of financial leverage, but because the quality of what he offers is recognized as exceptional by the people seeking it. An exceptional quality on the creative plane commands a response that money on the competitive plane cannot replicate. This is the unshakable logic of the true capital. It is not a philosophy of virtue. It is a law of creative force, and laws do not bend. When the competitive man observes the life of the man who has built true capital, he typically attributes what he sees to luck, to network, to being in the right place at the right time, or to possessing some personal charisma that cannot be analyzed or replicated. He reaches for these explanations because he is looking at the visible surface of something whose source is invisible. He sees the doors opening, the opportunities arriving, the relationships deepening, and the resources compounding. But he cannot see the invisible account that funded all of it, because he has never built one and therefore has no frame of reference for its existence. Wattles provides that frame. He names the mechanism, specifies the practice, and articulates the law with the precision of a man who understood that the invisible always precedes the visible, that the inner capital is always the cause, and the outer fortune is always the effect. The man who internalizes this understanding has received the fundamental insight from which all subsequent practice of the true capital flows. There is one more dimension of this logic that must be stated plainly, because it concerns a misreading of Wattles that is both common and costly. The true capital is not a long-term strategy for eventually obtaining the same things that money would obtain. It is not a slower road to the same destination. It is access to a fundamentally different class of acquisition. The loyalty that cannot be bought, the trust that survives adversity, the creative partnerships that generate beyond what any individual could produce alone, the compounding reputation that makes every future transaction more aligned than the last. These are not available at any price on the competitive plane. They are not simply expensive, they are genuinely out of reach, regardless of the sum offered, because the people and the situations that constitute them are themselves operating on the creative plane, and they do not respond to competitive instruments. The only currency they recognize is the currency of demonstrated creative force, the accumulated record of a man who has consistently given more than was asked, more than was expected, and more than the world required. That is the true capital. That is what purchases them, and no other form of wealth ever has or ever will. James Allen taught a principle of absolute correspondence between the inner life and the outer one, not as a consoling metaphor, but as a structural law of reality. In his analysis, a man attracts precisely what his character is, not merely what his character desires. The outer world, in Allen's teaching, is not a stage on which character performs. It is a faithful mirror in which character is reflected with the impartiality of a physical law. This means that the quality of what a man draws toward himself, the quality of his relationships, his opportunities, his circumstances, is always a precise measurement of the quality of his inner formation. The man who finds the world resistant is not facing bad fortune. He is facing his own character, expressed in the language of event and circumstance. Allen is unsparing in this analysis. He does not offer comfort to the man who has not done the inner work. He offers only the law and its implications. Wattles receives this foundation and specifies it in economic terms with a precision that Allen's work, for all its depth, does not fully supply. If Allen's law of correspondence tells us that the inner life determines the outer one, Wattles tells us exactly what that inner quality must express in the material world. In order to generate the true capital, it must express as the consistent, deliberate delivery of more use value than cash value in every exchange, powered by genuine creative intention rather than by calculation of return. Allen builds the character. Wattles deploys it, the man who has cultivated the genuine goodwill, the disciplined will, and the creative thought that Allen demands, and then channels those inner formations into the concrete practice of extraordinary use-value delivery that Wattles demands. Has assembled not two complementary teachings, but a single complete engine of compounding invisible capital. It would be a mistake to regard Allen and Wattles as parallel thinkers offering related insights from separate vantage points. Their relationship is sequential, and the sequence is non-negotiable. Allen first. Wattles always means second. The reason for this ordering is not chronological, it is logical. The man who attempts to practice Wattles' use-value principle without having done Allen's inner work of character formation will find that the practice is hollow. He will over-deliver because he has calculated that over-delivery produces return, which means he is still thinking transactionally, still on the competitive plane, still measuring by the ledger. He has merely moved to a different column. True capital is not generated by strategic generosity. It is generated by the expression of genuine inner quality. And that inner quality must be built before it can be expressed. This is Allen's domain, and this is why, in the full architecture of invisible capital, character formation is not preliminary. It is foundational. The specific inner qualities that Allen identifies as the necessary preconditions for creative force are worth naming in Wattles' terms, because the translation is illuminating. Allen's cultivation of pure motive becomes, in Wattles' framework, the capacity for genuinely creative intention, the ability to approach every exchange with the authentic desire to benefit the other, rather than with the desire to appear generous while extracting maximum value. Allen's discipline of thought becomes, in Wattles' framework, the mental consistency required to maintain the creative plane under pressure, to remain a generating force even when the competitive world exerts its habitual gravity toward extraction. Allen's clarity of purpose becomes, in Wattles' framework, the directional force that determines what is created, not merely that something is created. Without these inner foundations, the outer practice of use-value delivery becomes a performance. Skilled, perhaps, but fundamentally hollow, and therefore incapable of generating the depth of trust and creative reputation that constitute the true capital. There is a phenomenon that the alignment of Allen's character formation and Wattles' use-value principle produces that neither teaching produces alone, and it is worth examining closely because it represents the unique power of their synthesis. When a man of genuine inner quality, a man who has done the work Allen describes, enters into any exchange with the intention of delivering extraordinary use value, the people on the other side of that exchange perceive something they cannot always name, but always register. The difference between a man who is performing surplus and a man who is being surplus. The man who performs surplus does more than the contract requires, but he does it with the subtle tightness of one who is watching for the return. The man who is surplus, who has built the inner quality that Allen demands and channels it through the outer practice that Wattles demands, does not give more than is required because he has calculated its benefit. He gives more than is required because it is the natural expression of what he has become. And the people who encounter this quality recognize it with an immediacy that bypasses rational analysis. They trust it before they can explain why. This is the magnetism that Allen describes, the attraction of the outer world to the inner character, expressed in Wattles' economic terms as the spontaneous accumulation of true capital. The synthesis also produces a specific quality of creative force that becomes available only when both conditions are met simultaneously: genuine inner formation and consistent outer expression through use-value delivery. Wattles teaches that the thinking stuff of the universe responds to the creative thought of the man who aligns himself with it. That formless substance takes form in response to the directed mental force of the creative mind. Allen teaches that the mind achieves its highest directive power when it has been disciplined, purified, and aligned with genuine purpose. The man who has accomplished both conditions, who has the inner formation Allen demands and the outer creative practice Wattles demands, is not merely a man who is doing good work in the world. He is a man whose mental force is operating at the level where it can genuinely precipitate new value into form from the formless substance. His creative capacity is not figurative. In Wattles' metaphysical framing, it is literal. He is drawing from the inexhaustible source, and he is drawing with sufficient clarity of direction that what arrives is specific, aligned, and compounding. Consider what this means for the accumulation of true capital, when both Allen's and Wattles' conditions are fulfilled simultaneously. The outer world that Allen says mirrors the inner character begins to reflect not only a quality of goodness or discipline, but a quality of creative force. The man whose inner formation is one of genuine creative intention, and whose outer behavior is the consistent delivery of extraordinary use value, does not attract merely positive people and pleasant circumstances. He attracts people and circumstances that are themselves on the creative plane, other men and women who are generating rather than extracting, creating rather than competing, building true capital of their own rather than managing competitive advantage. The network that forms around the man who has accomplished both Allen's inner work and Wattles' outer practice is, therefore, not merely a support network. It is a generative ecosystem, a collection of creative forces that amplify each other's invisible capital and produce visible results at a rate that no single creative mind could achieve in isolation. The link between Allen and Wattles can be understood through a specific analogy that makes the sequential nature of their relationship clear. Allen's work is the metallurgy, the process of refining raw human material into the pure substance capable of conducting creative force. Wattles' work is the engineering, the precise design of how that refined substance is directed in the world to generate the maximum accumulation of true capital. A man who does the metallurgy but not the engineering has pure character that produces no structural output. Admirable, but economically inert. A man who does the engineering but not the metallurgy is trying to conduct creative force through impure material. The signal is weak, the output is inconsistent, and the true capital he generates is fragile because its inner foundation is compromised. Only the man who does both, who refines the substance with Allen and then engineers its application with Wattles, has the complete system operational. The metallurgy and the engineering together constitute the full apparatus of invisible capital formation. And the visible wealth that flows from that apparatus is not a goal that was pursued. It is a consequence that was made inevitable. It is worth examining a specific kind of relationship that becomes possible only when Allen's character formation and Wattles' use-value delivery are operating together at full depth. This is the relationship of genuine creative partnership, an association between two people who are both on the creative plane, both committed to generating more value than they consume, and who recognize in each other the quality of inner formation that makes sustained creative collaboration possible. These relationships are, in Wattles' framework, among the most powerful stores of true capital that a man can build, because they multiply creative force rather than merely adding to it. A man alone on the creative plane generates significant invisible capital. Two men of aligned creative force, operating together with mutual recognition of each other's inner quality, generate a combined force that is not the sum of their individual capacities, but something closer to their product. The mathematics of creative partnership, unlike the mathematics of competitive combination, is multiplicative, and the true capital that such partnerships generate has a compounding rate that individual accumulation, however consistent, cannot match. This is the strategic implication of Allen's and Wattles' synthesis for the man who is seriously engaged in building invisible capital. The greatest multiplier of the true capital is not working harder on one's own practice of use-value delivery, though that practice must never be abandoned. The greatest multiplier is the formation of genuine creative partnerships, relationships built on the foundation of mutual inner quality, sustained by the mutual practice of extraordinary use-value delivery, and directed by the shared intention of generating new value that neither partner could create alone. These partnerships do not form through networking in the competitive sense. Through the calculated exchange of contacts and favors that characterizes the competitive plane, they form through the natural attraction of like to like at the level of creative force. They form when a man of genuine inner quality, consistently expressing that quality through creative over-delivery, encounters another man of similar formation and recognizes the alignment. This recognition is itself a form of invisible capital, the capacity to identify and attract other creative forces. And it is available only to the man who has done both Allen's inner work and Wattles' outer practice. The Allen-Wattles synthesis also clarifies something about the nature of the failure mode that most people encounter when they attempt to apply Wattles' science of getting rich without Allen's prior foundation. The failure is not typically one of incorrect technique. It is one of insufficient depth. The man who attempts to practice the use-value principle from a character that has not been genuinely formed, who tries to be generous without being genuinely good, who tries to create without having cultivated the inner creative faculty, will find that the practice produces results that are real but limited, and that plateau at a level considerably below what the full synthesis would produce. This plateau is not the ceiling of Wattles' principle. It is the ceiling of an application of Wattles' principle that was attempted without Allen's prerequisite. The frustration of men who have worked hard at the outer practice and received less than they expected is almost always explained by the incompleteness of the inner work. Wattles is not at fault. Allen was simply not consulted first. There is a final dimension of the Allen-Wattles synthesis that concerns not the accumulation of true capital, but its deployment. The question of how a man spends the invisible currency he has built, and what that spending produces in the world. Allen teaches that the highest purpose of inner formation is the expansion of goodness, the expression of genuine love and service in every direction the man's life touches. Wattles teaches that the highest expression of creative force is the creation of value for others, the consistent generation of use-value surplus that improves the condition of every person who enters the man's sphere of economic influence. These two orientations, when they are aligned, when the man's motive is genuinely the service Allen describes, and his method is genuinely the creation Wattles describes, produce a quality of impact that is qualitatively different from anything that either teaching alone could generate. The man who has this alignment does not merely accumulate true capital. He becomes a source of true capital for others. A creative presence whose influence extends the invisible currency into every relationship and every exchange he touches. Building not merely his own invisible account, but the accounts of everyone in his creative field. This is the full expression of the Allen-Wattles synthesis. And it is, in the precise language of Wattles's metaphysics, the individual creative force functioning in alignment with the infinite creative intelligence that generates and sustains all wealth. What Wattles and Allen together describe is not two philosophies that happen to agree on certain points. They describe a single integrated law of creative force, approached from two angles, the inner and the outer, the character and the conduct. And their convergence on the same structural principle is itself evidence of the law's reality. Laws do not require the agreement of different thinkers to remain operative. But when different thinkers, approaching the same territory from different directions, arrive at the same structural conclusion, the probability that they have found something real, something that corresponds to the actual nature of how creative force operates in human life, increases to the point of near certainty. Allen first, Wattles always second. The sequence is not negotiable, and the synthesis is the complete engine of the true capital. The man who has understood this synthesis, who has grasped both the necessity of Allen's inner work and the precision of Wattles's outer practice, is now in possession of the complete framework. He knows what the true capital is. He knows what generates it. He knows what compound law governs its accumulation. And he knows, from the structure of the creative plane itself, that the man who operates this framework consistently, without the distraction of competitive comparison, and without the impatience of transactional expectation, is not merely building an invisible account. He is aligning himself with the fundamental creative force of the universe. And the universe, as Wattles teaches with the confidence of one who has tested the law and found it irrefutable, always responds to alignment with abundance. The man who delivers only what the transaction requires considers himself honorable. He has kept his word. He has satisfied the contract. He has given the amount agreed upon in exchange for the amount received. And he regards the ledger as balanced and the matter as closed. In the vocabulary of the competitive plane, he is correct. The transaction is complete, the obligation is discharged, and the relationship has been managed with professional efficiency. Wattles does not dispute the accuracy of this accounting. He disputes its sufficiency, because the man who delivers exactly what was required has not merely declined to build true capital. He has, by the precise logic of Wattles's creative law, actively prevented it from forming. And the regularity with which he does this is the regularity with which he trains his mind to operate at the permanent ceiling of competitive wealth. To understand why the even exchange is not merely neutral, but actively limiting, it is necessary to examine what the even exchange communicates at a level beneath the explicit content of the transaction. When a man delivers exactly what was contracted, no more, no less, he communicates something to the person on the other side of the exchange that goes beyond the terms of the agreement. He communicates the boundary of his creative investment. He communicates that this relationship, this person, this situation has been assessed, and that the assessment resulted in the decision to give exactly enough and no more. The person receiving this communication may not articulate it consciously, but they register it with the unerring accuracy of a biological instrument designed to measure the quality of human intention. They register the absence of surplus, and the absence of surplus registers as the absence of genuine creative care, which is, in Wattles' framework, the one thing the true capital is made of. Transactional thinking, Wattles teaches, is not a personality trait. It is a trained mode of engagement with reality. A set of mental habits so deeply grooved by the competitive culture in which most men are formed that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like accuracy. The transactional mind genuinely believes that it is being precise, that giving exactly what was agreed upon is the correct and professional response to any exchange, and that giving more is either naive or financially imprudent. This belief is the product of a complete misunderstanding of what kind of law governs the accumulation of real wealth. The transactional mind is working with the laws of the competitive plane, the laws of capture, of protection, of marginal extraction. And within those laws, the even exchange is indeed correct and professional. But those are not the laws of the creative plane. And the creative plane is the only plane where the true capital can be built. The critical word in Wattles' instruction is not more. It is consistent. The occasional act of over-delivery does not build true capital. It produces a pleasant exception in the experience of the recipient, who notes it, perhaps appreciates it, and files it alongside the memory of all the other transactions in which the man delivered exactly enough. What builds true capital is the consistent, unbroken practice of surplus. The pattern established across time and across relationships that makes over-delivery the expected quality of engagement with this particular man, not the exception. When surplus becomes the expected quality, it transforms from an act into a character attribute. And character attributes are what Allen teaches are the actual magnets of the outer world. The even exchange, practiced consistently, establishes a character attribute of precise sufficiency. The creative surplus, practiced consistently, establishes a character attribute of generative force. These two character attributes attract categorically different qualities of opportunity, relationship, and outcome, not as a reward for good behavior, but as the structural consequence of the law of correspondence operating on the character that has been formed. There is a specific cognitive distortion that transactional thinking produces over time, and it is worth examining because it illuminates why the even exchange is not merely a missed opportunity, but an active form of self-limitation. The man who consistently delivers exactly what was required gradually trains his perception to see only what was required. His attention narrows to the contractual minimum, to the explicit deliverable, the agreed standard, the baseline expectation. He loses the perceptual range to notice what more could be done, what additional value could be introduced, what unexpected quality of service or thought or care could transform the experience of the person he is serving. This narrowing of perception is not a consequence of limited intelligence. It is a consequence of practiced habit. The mind attends to what it has been trained to attend to. And the mind trained on sufficiency cannot perceive the opportunities for surplus that are available in every exchange, not because those opportunities are hidden, but because the perceptual apparatus has been calibrated to see only up to the level of the contractual requirement. The inversion of this distortion is equally precise. The man who practices creative surplus consistently gradually trains his perception to see the opportunities for over-delivery that are invisible to the transactional mind. He enters every exchange with the active question: what additional value is available here that has not been asked for? And because he asks this question consistently, his mind begins to find answers with increasing ease and speed. He notices what the person actually needs beneath what they explicitly requested. He identifies the additional dimension of value that would transform a satisfactory experience into a remarkable one. He perceives the creative possibility that the transactional mind cannot see, because the transactional mind is looking at the floor of the contract, not at the ceiling of what genuine creative force could produce. This trained perceptual capacity is itself a form of true capital, a faculty of creative vision that multiplies the opportunities for surplus available to the man who has built it. Wattles goes further than simply recommending the abandonment of transactional thinking. He teaches that the man who wants to move beyond the ceiling of competitive wealth must not merely practice surplus. He must cultivate the inner orientation from which surplus naturally flows. The enemy of this inner orientation is not laziness or incompetence. It is fear. Specifically, the fear of the even exchange disguised as the wisdom of the even exchange. The belief that delivering more than was required is a form of imbalance that will eventually leave the giver depleted, disadvantaged, or exploited. This fear is the competitive plane's most effective defense mechanism against creative development. It sounds like prudence. It feels like self-protection. But it is, in Wattles' analysis, the precise mental posture of the man who has confused the laws of the competitive plane with the laws of reality, who has mistaken the constraints of a zero-sum game for the nature of the universe itself. The reality that Wattles opposes to this fear is not a promise that generosity will never be taken advantage of in any particular instance. It is a structural principle that the man who operates consistently on the creative plane, who gives genuine surplus in every exchange drawn from a genuine inner intention of creative service, is not drawing from a finite supply that can be depleted by the extraction of others. He is drawing from the formless, inexhaustible creative substance that Wattles identifies as the source of all genuine wealth. A man drawing from an inexhaustible source cannot be depleted by those who take. He can only be limited by his own failure to keep drawing. This is why Wattles' instruction to abandon transactional thinking is not an invitation to recklessness. It is an invitation to a different understanding of where value comes from, and the recognition that the source is the creative faculty itself, not the finite stock of resources that the competitive plane is perpetually defending. The question of what the even exchange produces, taken to its logical conclusion over the course of a life, is one of the most sobering that Wattles' teaching raises. The man who spends 50 years delivering exactly what was contracted, who maintains the balanced ledger with perfect consistency across every relationship, every transaction, every exchange, will have accumulated, at the end of those 50 years, a record of professional competence. He will have satisfied expectations. He will have kept his word. He will have done what was required. And he will have nothing in the true capital account. No depth of trust that was tested and held. No creative reputation that arrived ahead of him and opened doors before he knocked. No network of people who chose him, not because he was the only option, but because his track record of genuine surplus made the choice feel inevitable. No compounding goodwill arriving from directions he never targeted. The ledger will be balanced, and the true capital account will be empty. This is the precise cost of transactional thinking, stated not as a moral judgment, but as a structural outcome. The abandonment of transactional thinking is not a single decision made once. It is a practice that must be maintained against the constant gravitational pull of the competitive plane. Because the competitive plane is the default condition of ordinary life, and its language and logic are reinforced by nearly every institution, every relationship, and every conversation that constitutes the environment of most men's daily experience. The man who decides to operate on the creative plane will find the competitive plane pulling at him constantly. Through the reasonable sounding voice, that tells him he has already given enough, that the other person hasn't noticed the surplus anyway, that the next transaction is where he will make up the difference. These are the voices of the competitive plane speaking in the language of the creative, and the man who cannot distinguish between them will be pulled back below the ceiling every time. The practice of creative surplus must therefore be sustained not merely as a behavioral commitment, but as a metaphysical conviction. The genuine, internalized understanding that the source is inexhaustible, that the creative plane is real, and that every act of genuine surplus is a deposit into an account whose returns exceed anything the competitive plane has ever produced. Wattles also addresses the specific error of selective surplus, the practice of delivering extraordinary use value in high visibility context, while reverting to the even exchange in lower visibility ones. The man who over-delivers to important clients but is merely sufficient to minor ones, who gives creative surplus when the relationship is new and impressive, but settles to transactional minimum once the relationship is established, who presents surplus when it is being observed but retreats to sufficiency when it is not. This man is not practicing the creative principle. He is practicing impression management with creative vocabulary, which is a competitive strategy with an aesthetic coding. And it does not build true capital, because true capital is built through the unconditional quality of the practice, not through its strategic deployment. The consistency of surplus across all levels of visibility, in large transactions and small ones, with powerful people and obscure ones, when the outcome matters enormously and when it appears not to matter at all, is the signature of the man who has genuinely made the transition from the competitive to the creative plane. And that consistency is what builds the depth of reputation and the quality of trust that the true capital, at its highest accumulation, consists of. There is a counterintuitive implication of Wattles' teaching on transactional thinking that bears explicit statement. The man who abandons the even exchange does not become less precise about what he receives. He becomes more precise about what he gives. This distinction is crucial. The abandonment of transactional thinking does not mean the abandonment of clarity about value and compensation. Wattles is not teaching the man to undercharge, to refuse fair payment, or to make a virtue of financial imprecision. He is teaching the man to hold a different relationship to the gap between what he charges and what he delivers. He should charge clearly, fairly, and in accordance with the value of what he creates. And he should deliver consistently more than that charge would require. Not because he is unclear about his worth, but because the surplus is the precise mechanism by which the true capital is built. The precision is in the giving, not in the reducing of what is received. The man who confuses these has misread Wattles entirely. The final implication of the eradication of transactional thinking concerns the experience of the man himself, the quality of engagement, the sense of creative aliveness, the felt reality of operating from genuine surplus rather than calculated sufficiency. The transactional mind experiences every exchange as a negotiation to be managed, a balance to be maintained, a cost to be minimized. This experience, regardless of the financial outcomes it produces, is a form of chronic contraction, a perpetual pulling back from the full expression of creative force. The man on the creative plane, operating from genuine surplus with genuine inner intention, experiences the opposite. An expansion, a generative opening, the felt sense of a creative force moving through him outward into the world and returning, compounded from every direction it reaches. This is not a minor experiential difference. It is the difference between a life lived in management and a life lived in creation. And creation, in Wattles' deepest teaching, is not merely the optimal strategy for the accumulation of true capital. It is the natural condition of the man who has aligned himself with the fundamental nature of things, who has understood that he is not a container of finite resources competing for more, but a channel of infinite creative force, building the only capital that has ever purchased what actually matters. Wallace Wattles describes the accumulation of true capital not as a linear process of addition, but as a compounding phenomenon, one that follows the same fundamental logic as financial compound interest, but that operates on a substrate with no natural upper bound. Financial compounding is constrained by the size of the principal, the rate available in the market, and the time available to the investor. The compounding of true capital is constrained by none of these things, because its principle is not a fixed sum of money, but the creative faculty of a mind that expands through use. Its rate is not set by market conditions, but by the quality and consistency of the creative surplus being generated. And the time available to it is not limited by market cycles, but only by the lifespan of the man who is building it. To understand why this difference in substrate produces such a radical difference in potential, it is necessary to examine the mechanism of compounding use value with the same precision one would bring to understanding the mechanism of any powerful natural force. When a man delivers genuine creative surplus in any exchange, when the use value he provides exceeds the cash value he receives by a meaningful margin, and when this surplus is delivered with genuine creative intention rather than strategic calculation, the immediate recipient of that surplus has an experience, not a transaction. An experience. And the nature of that experience, the quality of being genuinely served beyond what was expected, of receiving more care and more creative force than the agreement required, produces in the recipient a specific response that a standard transaction never produces: the desire to account for what they have received. This desire manifests in two primary channels. The first is testimony, the compelled communication of the remarkable to others. The second is loyalty, the preferential return to the source of the surplus in future exchanges over every other option available. Both channels are compounding mechanisms. Testimony expands the network from which future exchanges will arise. Loyalty deepens the value of existing relationships, making each subsequent exchange richer than the one before. Together, they constitute the first wave of compounding, the immediate return on a single act of genuine over-delivery. But the first wave is the least powerful of the compounding mechanisms, and this is something Wattles' teaching makes clear. The recipients of the first wave, the people who received the testimony and who have now entered into exchanges with the man because of it, are themselves subjects of the same compounding law. If they too receive extraordinary use value, they generate their own testimony, their own loyalty, their own wave of compounding effect. And the man at the origin of the first act of surplus receives the benefit of that second wave as well. Not directly, not immediately, not in a form that any particular transaction would reveal, but as an ambient accumulation of reputation, trust, and creative influence that spreads through the network with the quiet inevitability of a principle at work. The second wave compounds the first. The third wave compounds the second. And by the time this process has been operating for years, quietly, consistently, without requiring the man's direct attention in the expanded network, the accumulated true capital is operating at a scale and with an effectiveness that bears no traceable relationship to the specific acts of surplus that originally generated it. This is the nature of compounding on the creative plane. Its later effects are always disproportionate to its initial causes. There is a period in the accumulation of true capital that represents the most critical test of the man building it. And Wattles' teaching addresses it with the gravity it deserves. This is the period of invisible building, the early and middle phase of consistent surplus delivery, in which the compounding is real, but the returns are not yet visible in any form the man can point to as evidence. The world does not yet appear to be responding. The doors are not yet opening more easily. The opportunities are not yet arriving from unexpected directions. The reputation is building, but it has not yet reached the threshold at which it begins to move through the network under its own momentum. This period is where most men abandon the practice, not because they have decided the principle is false, but because the absence of visible return in the environment of the competitive plane reads as the absence of real return. They conclude that the compounding is not occurring, when in fact it is occurring at exactly the rate that the quality and consistency of their surplus dictates. They stop at precisely the moment before the compounding reaches critical mass and begins producing the visible results that would confirm everything they have invested. Wattles is absolutely precise on this point. The man who does not understand the compounding nature of true capital will always stop too soon. He will mistake the invisibility of early compounding for the absence of compounding. He will interpret the delayed return as evidence of a failed principle, rather than as the expected behavior of a system that accumulates invisibly before it expresses visibly. The scientific analogy is exact. A substance can be undergoing a chemical transformation at every moment without producing any visible change, right up until the moment when the transformation reaches completion and the change becomes suddenly and completely apparent. The true capital compounds in exactly this way. The man who keeps depositing surplus, who does not require visible confirmation before the next act of over-delivery, who trusts the creative law the way a scientist trusts a verified principle, will pass through the threshold of invisible accumulation and arrive at the phase of visible return with a capital account that has been building, uninterrupted, for the entire duration of his patience. The question of consistency deserves its own examination, because it is not a simple behavioral commitment. Consistency in the practice of creative surplus means delivering the same quality of over-delivery in difficult circumstances as in favorable ones. When the relationship is strained, when the financial pressure is acute, when the recipient seems unlikely to notice, when the immediate return appears negligible, most men who attempt the practice find that their consistency is conditional. They over-deliver when it is easy and revert to the even exchange when maintaining the surplus requires genuine cost. This conditional consistency does not build compounding true capital. It builds a variable record, peaks of surplus followed by troughs of adequacy. And variable records produce variable reputations, which produce variable levels of trust, which produce variable access to the opportunities that true capital purchases. The compounding of true capital requires unconditional consistency, not because Wattles demands moral perfection, but because the compounding mechanism requires an unbroken deposit record to achieve the critical mass at which the returns begin to exceed the deposits. The metaphysical dimension of this compounding process is not incidental to Wattles' analysis. It is central to it. Wattles teaches that every act of genuine creative surplus is a transaction with the thinking stuff of the universe, a deposit into the formless creative substance that underlies all visible reality and from which all visible wealth is precipitated into form. This is not a decorative claim. It is the foundational premise of his entire metaphysics. The man who consistently delivers more use value than cash value is not only building a social and reputational account, he is, in Wattles's precise language, operating in alignment with the creative intelligence that governs the material world. And this alignment produces a response that is not merely human and social, but cosmic and structural. The formless substance responds to creative force directed into it with generative intention. It returns, compounded, through every channel available to the man who is aligned with it. The social and reputational compounding is the visible expression of this metaphysical return. The two are not separate processes. They are the same process observed at different levels of resolution. What does it look like in practical terms? When the compounding of true capital reaches critical mass and begins to produce visible returns at a rate that the man himself experiences as remarkable. Wattles describes this threshold in terms that are highly specific and recognizable. Opportunities begin arriving that were not solicited. Situations that match the man's creative capacities with an exactness that sequential pursuit could not have achieved. People come to him with resources, with proposals, with access, and with relationships that he would have had to expend enormous force to reach through competitive means, but that arrive naturally through the network of people who have either directly experienced his creative surplus or received the testimony of those who have. The quality of the exchanges available to him elevates, because the people who approach him are themselves people of equivalent creative force, attracted by the reputation that his surplus has built. And the terms of those exchanges favor him not because he has negotiated from financial leverage, but because the recognized quality of what he produces gives him a form of negotiating power that no competitive instrument can replicate. The power of being sought by someone who genuinely values what only he can provide. This threshold of critical mass is not experienced as a sudden windfall. Wattles is precise about this because the misunderstanding of what the threshold feels like has caused many men to not recognize it when they cross it. The crossing of the threshold does not feel like a dramatic change. It feels like a confirmation, the quiet, settled recognition that the world has begun responding in a way that is now consistent with the inner capital that was always building. The man who crosses this threshold does not become surprised by his own success. He recognizes it as the natural consequence of the law he has been operating, expressed at the level of visible reality. He does not experience it as fortune or luck. He experiences it as structural inevitability. The outer world finally reflecting the inner account that he has been building with patient, consistent, unconditional creative surplus for the entire duration of the accumulation period. There is one more dimension of the compounding of true capital that has not yet been addressed, and it concerns the compounding that occurs not in the outer network, but in the inner creative faculty of the man himself. Every act of genuine over-delivery is simultaneously a practice of creative perception, an exercise of the faculty that sees what additional value is possible beyond what was required. And this faculty, like every genuine faculty, grows stronger through exercise. The man who has been practicing creative surplus for years has developed a quality of creative perception that is genuinely superior to what he possessed at the beginning of the practice. Not because he has become smarter in a general sense, but because he has specifically trained the most generative perceptual capacity a man can possess. The ability to see value that does not yet exist and to bring it into form. This internal compounding of creative capacity is the most durable of all the forms of true capital, because it is not subject to the conditions of the external world. It resides entirely within the man. No market crash can depreciate it. No crisis can dilute it. No competitive force can capture it. It is the man himself, developed to the point of genuine creative mastery. And this, in the deepest reading of Wattles' teaching, is the ultimate form of the true capital. Not what the man has built outside himself, but what he has become inside. The accumulation of true capital through the compounding of use-value surplus is, therefore, not merely a strategy for the acquisition of wealth, relationships, and opportunity. It is a process of human development, the progressive expansion of the creative faculty through its consistent exercise in the service of genuine over-delivery. The man who builds true capital is not merely accumulating an invisible asset. He is becoming a more powerful creative force. A man whose capacity to generate value increases with every passing year, whose perceptual range expands with every act of genuine surplus, whose inner account grows not only through what he deposits, but through the growth of the depositing faculty itself. This is the compounding with no upper limit that Wattles describes. It is not a financial projection. It is a description of what happens to a man who aligns himself with the creative plane and stays there. Consistently, with discipline, with genuine intention, and with the patience to allow the invisible accumulation to reach the threshold at which it expresses as visible abundance. The man who understands this has understood the deepest logic of the true capital, and the man who acts on this understanding has begun the only form of accumulation that compounds without ceiling, without depletion, and without end. The man who operates exclusively on cash value, who charges the maximum the market will bear, delivers precisely what the contract specifies, and considers the closing of the transaction. The closing of any obligation is not a villain in Wattles' framework. He is not even necessarily an unethical man. He may be honest. He may be reliable. He may keep every word of every agreement he makes. But Wattles identifies him as a man who is, by his own consistent behavioral choices, preventing the formation of the one asset that would purchase for him everything his money cannot reach. He is not merely leaving value on the table in an economic sense. He is actively, repeatedly, and systematically preventing the formation of the invisible currency that would transform his entire relationship with the material world. This is not a small oversight. It is the central poverty of a man who may be financially successful by every conventional measure. The poverty of the even exchange operates through a mechanism that is subtle enough to be invisible to the man experiencing it. And this invisibility is precisely what makes it so durable as a limitation. The man who practices the even exchange consistently receives adequate confirmation for the practice, because the competitive plane does confirm the even exchange. Relationships are maintained, contracts are renewed. The professional reputation of a man who delivers reliably on his commitments is a genuine asset. He is trusted to do what he says he will do. He is regarded as professional and competent. These returns are real, and they feel like the complete set of returns available from good professional behavior. Nothing in the experience of the competitive plane reveals that a parallel and far more powerful set of returns exists and is being consistently forfeited. The even exchange provides enough positive feedback to sustain itself, and the absence of true capital returns is attributed to factors other than the practice that is preventing them. The man continues. The ceiling holds. Wattles observes that the habit of the even exchange does something to the mind of the man who practices it that goes deeper than behavioral limitation. It trains the mind to operate within a specific perceptual frame, the frame of contractual sufficiency. And this training has epistemological consequences. The man whose mind is trained to the even exchange does not merely behave within contractual limits. He begins to perceive within them. His attention, his planning, his creative assessment of any situation are all calibrated to the question, what is required? Not what is possible, not what would genuinely serve, but what is required. And the answer to what is required is always a ceiling, never a direction. The man who lives by this question is intellectually confined to the minimum of every situation. Not because he lacks intelligence, but because his intelligence has been directed by habit to the floor of the contract rather than to the horizon of the creative plane. What the habit of even exchange does to a man's relationships is perhaps its most consequential long-term effect, and it is one that accumulates so gradually as to be nearly imperceptible until the full extent of the impoverishment becomes apparent. Relationships that are maintained entirely on the basis of transactional sufficiency do not deepen. They stabilize at the level of professional adequacy, functional, reliable, and entirely lacking the quality of genuine trust that transforms a relationship from an exchange into a creative partnership. The man who has spent years in exclusively transactional relationships finds himself, at some point, in possession of many contacts and very few allies. Many people who would recommend him within the scope of what they have experienced, but none who would go to exceptional lengths on his behalf. None who would offer him access that was not already available to every other qualified person on the market. None who would choose him from a position of personal conviction rather than competitive comparison. This is not a social failure. It is the precise economic consequence of an invisible capital account that was never opened. There is a quality in the experience of receiving genuine creative surplus, of being on the receiving end of a man's authentic over-delivery, that the even exchange can never produce. And it is worth examining closely because it explains why the true capital builds the specific kind of loyalty and trust that it does. When a person receives exactly what was agreed upon, their experience is one of satisfaction, a mild, neutral confirmation that the world operated as expected. Satisfaction is a stable but motivationally inert state. It does not generate testimony. It does not generate loyalty beyond the next transaction. It does not produce the sense of genuine connection that comes from feeling genuinely valued rather than merely adequately served. When a person receives genuine creative surplus, when they realize that the man across from them gave more than the agreement required, more than the market demands, more than they expected, their experience is categorically different. They feel seen, not as a transaction, but as a person whose actual needs and actual life were taken seriously by the man serving them. This feeling of being seen is one of the rarest and most powerful experiences in ordinary human life. And the man who produces it consistently is building a quality of loyalty and affinity that no competitive instrument and no financial inducement could generate or replicate. The training of the competitive ceiling is not merely a limitation on the man's external acquisitions. It is a limitation on the man himself, on what he can perceive, what he can imagine, what he can become. The even exchange, practiced as a life philosophy, produces a specific kind of person, competent, reliable, professional, and permanently bounded. He is bounded not by external constraint, but by the internalized limits of his own operating principle. The ceiling he experiences in his wealth, his relationships, and his access to opportunity is not imposed on him from outside. It is constructed from within, by the consistent practice of a mode of engagement with the world that has a built-in upper limit. And because the ceiling is internal, no external change of circumstance, no new market, no new relationship no new financial windfall, will lift it. The ceiling moves with the man, because it is the man. The only thing that lifts it is the fundamental reorientation from the even exchange to the creative surplus, the shift from what is required to what is possible. Wattles teaches that the fatality of the even exchange is compounded by its self-confirming logic on the competitive plane. The man who practices it does not suffer visible, immediate consequences. He simply fails to build what the surplus would have built. And the absence of the true capital account is invisible to anyone who does not know what to look for. He sees others who seem to have connections he cannot access, doors open to them that do not open for him, opportunities arriving at them from directions he cannot trace. He attributes this differential not to a difference in their invisible capital, but to luck, to favoritism, to network advantages he was not given at the start. He does not consider that the difference might be entirely located in a practice that costs nothing to begin and requires no starting advantage to execute. He does not consider it because the competitive plane has no vocabulary for this analysis. The language of the competitive plane can describe financial advantage, network advantage, informational advantage. It cannot describe the advantage of a man who has spent years depositing genuine creative surplus into an invisible account that now commands the loyalty, the trust, and the creative force of everyone it has touched. Wattles provides that vocabulary, and the man who learns it has been given the analytical tool to diagnose his own ceiling with precision, and the practical instruction to dismantle it. The final poverty of the even exchange is this. It is the precise practice of treating every person as a transaction rather than as a person, as a means to a defined end, rather than as an individual whose life can be genuinely improved by the quality of creative force brought to their service. This is not merely a philosophical objection. It is a description of what prevents the most powerful of all true capital mechanisms from operating. The mechanism of genuine human connection. Genuine connection. The recognition between two people that one of them has actually seen and actually served the other with the full force of their creative capacity is not built by the even exchange. It cannot be. The even exchange, by definition, gives only what was agreed upon, which is never more than what the other person expected. Genuine connection requires the unexpected. The surplus that was not asked for, not contracted for, not anticipated, and that arrives as evidence of genuine care and genuine creative force. This unexpected surplus is the foundation of the most durable human bonds in existence. And those bonds are the tissue of which the most powerful true capital accounts are constructed. The man who never gives unexpected surplus never builds this tissue. And the true capital account that would be built from it remains forever empty. Its potential unrealized, its compounding unstarted, its returns never arrived. This is the full and complete poverty of the even exchange. Not the absence of a tactic, but the absence of the only form of capital that purchases what money has never reached. Wattles does not speak in vague generalities about what the true capital purchases. He is precise in a way that most teachers of wealth philosophy are not, because his teaching is built on the foundation of a rigorous analysis of what money actually cannot do. Not what it has not yet done, but what it is structurally incapable of doing, regardless of quantity, regardless of the skill with which it is deployed. The first and most foundational thing that the true capital purchases is loyalty. Not the loyalty of agreement, not the loyalty of financial dependence, not the loyalty of contractual obligation, but the loyalty of genuine choice. This is the loyalty of people who could leave at any moment, who have other options, who are not bound by contract or circumstance, but who choose to remain because the quality of the creative force they have received from this man is a quality they have not found anywhere else and are not willing to forego. This loyalty is the most valuable form of human capital in existence, and no sum of money has ever purchased it. Because money can purchase presence, but not the choice to be present. Compliance, but not the will to remain. The distinction between purchased loyalty and genuine loyalty is not a subtle one when it is examined in the light of what each actually provides in moments of consequence. Purchased loyalty holds precisely as long as the purchase price remains competitive. As long as the financial terms on offer are the best terms available, the moment a better offer arrives, purchased loyalty dissolves with a speed and completeness that reveals its true nature. It was never loyalty at all. It was a calculation, and calculations are revised when the variables change. Genuine loyalty, built through the consistent delivery of creative surplus and the accumulated trust that surplus produces over time, does not behave this way. It holds through moments of crisis. It holds when the financial terms are temporarily unfavorable. It holds when the relationship is tested by difficulty, misalignment, or the appearance of superior alternatives. Because the foundation of genuine loyalty is not the current terms of the exchange, but the accumulated record of genuine creative service, which is a form of evidence that no rival offer can erase and no financial inducement can override. A man who possesses this loyalty possesses something that the wealthiest competitive man in any room cannot replicate or purchase, regardless of the resources at his disposal. The true capital also purchases what might be called crisis trust, the specific quality of trust that does not merely sustain a relationship in good conditions, but deepens it through adversity. Most relationships in the competitive plane are tested and diminished by crisis. When things go wrong, when expectations are not met, when the unforeseen disrupts the anticipated. This is the natural behavior of relationships built on transactional sufficiency. They are calibrated for the conditions in which they were formed, and they have no reserve of genuine trust to draw upon when those conditions deteriorate. The relationship built on the true capital behaves differently when crisis arrives. The accumulated record of genuine creative surplus has built in the other person a reservoir of trust that is not based on the current performance of the exchange, but on the pattern of the entire relationship. When the current performance falters, as it must periodically in any real relationship, that reservoir does not dry up. It provides the tolerance, the patience, and the genuine commitment to resolution that transforms the crisis from a terminal event into a test that the relationship survives, and often that deepens the trust rather than diminishing it. Crisis trust, purchased by the true capital, is one of the most economically consequential assets a man can possess, because the man who is trusted through adversity is the man who is chosen when the stakes are highest. There is a class of opportunity that is never publicly available, never posted in any market, never offered through any formal channel, never accessible through any process of competitive application. These opportunities are controlled by people who are themselves on the creative plane, who have accumulated their own true capital, and who have learned through direct experience that the most consequential allocations of their resources, their capital, their access, their relationships, their time, must be directed only to people who have demonstrated the same quality of creative force and genuine integrity that they themselves have built. These people do not respond to financial proposals. They do not respond to credentials. They do not respond to competitive positioning. They respond to demonstrated character, to the track record of genuine creative surplus that constitutes the true capital account. The man who has built true capital sufficient to be recognized by these people as a peer, as someone whose inner quality is evidenced by the same kind of compounding creative over-delivery that they themselves have practiced, gains access to a category of opportunity that is entirely invisible to the man on the competitive plane. This access is one of the most precise and consequential things that the true capital purchases, and it cannot be obtained by any other means. What does genuine access look like at this level of the true capital? It looks like the conversation that takes place in the room after the formal meeting has ended. The one in which the real decisions are made by people who trust each other at a depth that was built over years of mutual creative investment. It looks like the introduction that is given not because the introducer was asked, but because the quality of the man being introduced makes the act of introduction a service to both parties. It looks like the proposal that is evaluated on its merit from the first paragraph, rather than being filtered through the skepticism that all strangers receive. It looks like the opportunity that arrives before it is even publicly known to exist, because the people who control it are looking for a specific quality of character and creative force. They know where to look for it, and the man who has built true capital sufficient to be known by them as possessing it is the man they approach first. Every one of these access points is a product of the invisible currency. Every one of them is permanently closed to the man who has only money to offer. The true capital also purchases the specific quality of creative partnership that transforms a man's productive capacity from individual to collective, from the output of one creative mind to the compounded output of several, operating in genuine alignment. Wattles' teaching on the creative plane makes clear that the generation of genuine new value is a product of creative force, not of financial capital, and that creative force is amplified when it operates in concert with other creative forces of similar quality. But such partnerships cannot be bought. They cannot be contracted into existence or engineered through organizational design. They form between people who have built enough true capital to recognize each other's inner quality, who can see, through the track record of each other's consistent surplus delivery, that the other person is genuinely on the creative plane and capable of the sustained generative commitment that real creative partnership demands. The man who has true capital sufficient to attract these partnerships has multiplied his productive capacity in a way that no amount of financial capital can replicate. That's because financial capital can fund the execution of ideas, but cannot generate the creative force that produces them. Only genuine creative partnership between men of established inner quality and demonstrated commitment to surplus can generate the compounded creative force that produces results no individual mind could achieve alone. The reputation that true capital builds is a form of acquisition distinct from every other form of capital, and Wattles treats it with the precision it deserves. The competitive reputation is a managed asset, an impression of quality maintained through the strategic control of information, through marketing, through the curation of visible evidence of competence and reliability. This kind of reputation is expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and structurally fragile. A single visible failure can damage it in ways that years of managed impression cannot repair. The creative reputation, the reputation built by the consistent practice of genuine surplus, communicated through the independent testimony of the people who have experienced it, is structurally different at every point. It is built for free by the people who benefited from the surplus. It is maintained automatically because each subsequent act of surplus reinforces and deepens the existing impression rather than requiring independent maintenance. And it is robust under adversity, because it is not based on an impression that can be disrupted, but on a pattern of experience that has been verified repeatedly across varied conditions. The creative reputation does not need defending. It has already been verified. This kind of reputation precedes a man into every room, and the quality of the reception waiting for him in that room is one of the clearest measures of the true capital account he has built. What the true capital purchases in terms of financial return, and Wattles is unambiguous that it does purchase financial return in abundance, must be understood in its correct causal sequence. The financial return is not the primary purchase. It is the consequence of the other purchases. The man who has genuine loyalty working for him, crisis trust protecting him, exclusive access available to him, creative partnerships multiplying his force, and a compounding reputation preceding him into every situation, finds that the financial dimension of his life organizes itself with a quality of ease and alignment that is genuinely not available to the competitive man. He does not need to pursue every opportunity aggressively, because the best opportunities arrive at him. He does not need to negotiate from a position of competitive leverage, because the recognized quality of what he offers creates its own form of leverage, the leverage of genuine value rather than financial pressure. He does not need to manage every relationship defensively, because the trust he has built provides a cushion of goodwill that absorbs the ordinary frictions of business without producing the defensive contractions that characterize competitive relationships. The financial abundance follows from these structural conditions as a natural consequence. Not because wealth was pursued, but because the conditions that make wealth inevitable were built with patient, consistent, unconditional creative surplus. The man who has built true capital sufficient to generate these conditions does not experience his financial life as a pursuit. He experiences it as a confirmation, the visible expression of an invisible reality that he has been building quietly and consistently for the duration of the practice. This is the inversion of the competitive experience, in which financial results are always the primary object of pursuit, and every other dimension of life is managed in service of that pursuit. The man of true capital does not manage relationships for financial return. He builds them with genuine creative intention, and the financial return is what that genuine intention, operating through the creative law of surplus and compounding, inevitably and structurally produces. Wattles makes this sequence explicit because its inversion, the attempt to obtain the financial results without building the invisible capital that generates them, is the precise error of the competitive man, and the precise explanation for why the doors remain closed to him regardless of the money he accumulates. The true capital is not an instrument in the service of financial goals. It is the source from which financial abundance flows as a structural consequence. And the man who builds the source, rather than chasing the consequence, has understood the deepest practical teaching in all of Wattles's work. The true capital also purchases something that has no financial category at all, and yet is, in any serious assessment of a human life, among the most consequential acquisitions available. The quality of the inner life itself. The man who has spent years on the creative plane, who has practiced genuine surplus with genuine intention, who has built the inner formation that Allen demands and expressed it through the outer practice that Wattles demands, does not merely have a different economic situation from the transactional man. He is a different person. He has developed a quality of creative perception, a depth of genuine engagement with the people and situations of his life, and a felt sense of generative purpose that is categorically different from anything available on the competitive plane. He is not perpetually defending a position. He is perpetually expanding a capacity. He is not managing a finite resource against the claims of competitors. He is drawing from an inexhaustible source and directing its creative force toward the service of every life it touches. This inner life, this quality of creative aliveness in every engagement, is, in Wattles' metaphysics, the direct experience of alignment with the creative intelligence of the universe. And the man who possesses it possesses something that transcends every other item on the list of what the true capital purchases. He possesses himself, fully developed, fully operational, fully aligned with the force that generates all genuine wealth. And that, in any measure of what a human life can achieve, is the supreme acquisition. The true capital also purchases time, not as minutes and hours, but as the quality of time that a man actually inhabits when his attention is not consumed by the defensive, extractive, competitive management of his position. The competitive man is never not competing. Even in his moments of rest, the competitive logic is running, assessing threat, calculating advantage, measuring position. This is not living. It is a permanent state of mobilization in the service of a game that has no natural endpoint and no condition of genuine satisfaction. The man of true capital does not inhabit this state because he is not competing. He is creating, and the creative state, the genuine experience of generating new value from the formless substance of creative possibility, is one of the most intrinsically satisfying states available to a human being. He is not waiting to win so that he can begin to live. He is living in every act of genuine surplus, in every moment of creative force expressed outward into the world. This is perhaps the most unexpected item on the list of what the true capital purchases, but it is, in the experience of the man who possesses it, the most immediately felt. The relief and the fullness of no longer competing, of having permanently and irrevocably moved from the plane of capture to the plane of creation, and of inhabiting, at last, the condition for which the creative faculty was made. The full inventory of what the true capital purchases: genuine loyalty, crisis trust, exclusive access, creative partnership, compounding reputation, financial abundance, the quality of inner life, and the freedom from perpetual competition, represents a complete alternative economy to the one in which most men spend their lives. It is an economy invisible to the competitive eye, inaccessible to competitive instruments, and available only to the man who has understood that the most powerful currency is not printed, not transferred, and not accumulated in any conventional account. It is generated through the consistent practice of creative surplus by a mind aligned with the creative plane, built slowly, compounded invisibly, and expressed eventually as the complete transformation of every dimension of a man's life. This is what Wattles calls the true capital. This is what it purchases. And this is why the man who possesses it does not need to pursue what money pursues. Because what money pursues is only a fraction of what the true capital commands. There is a recognizable shift that Wattles describes in the life of the man who has built true capital past the threshold of critical mass. A shift in the direction of force, in the quality of arrival, in the felt texture of every day. The man who has not yet crossed this threshold experiences his life primarily as a pursuit of opportunities, of relationships, of resources, of the next advantage that will improve his position. This is not a criticism. It is the accurate description of what operating on the creative plane looks like before the invisible account has reached sufficient depth to begin generating visible returns at a rate that exceeds the man's direct effort. He is working toward the threshold. The work is real. The deposits are genuine, but the compounding has not yet reached the phase of visible expression. Then, at a point that cannot be precisely anticipated, because it is determined not by calendar time, but by the accumulated depth of the true capital account, the direction of force changes. The man who has crossed the threshold does not experience a sudden windfall. He experiences, gradually and then consistently, a reversal in the direction of arrival. Things begin coming to him that he did not go to. Opportunities present themselves from relationships he invested in months or years earlier without expectation of return. Investments that, from a transactional point of view, had long since been written off as generous gestures with no discernible outcome. People recommend him before he is asked, to people he has never met. For opportunities he had no knowledge existed, resources appear through channels he could not have mapped in advance because they are the product of a compounding network of testimony and loyalty that has been building quietly, without his direct management, for the entire duration of his practice. The arrival of these things does not feel like luck, because luck is random and these arrivals are directional. They are aligned with his specific capacities, his specific creative force, his specific quality of inner formation. They are not indiscriminate gifts from fortune. They are precise returns from an invisible account, compounded interest, arriving in forms that are specific to what was deposited and directional toward what the man has become. Wattles is careful to distinguish the threshold experience from the ordinary oscillation of competitive fortune. From the good runs that punctuate every competitive man's life, and that are always followed by the contractions and reversals that the competitive plane produces. The difference is not merely the quality of what arrives, but the consistency of the direction. The competitive man has periods of good fortune followed by periods of difficulty, and he cannot determine from inside those fluctuations whether he is in a temporary peak or a permanent improvement. The man who has crossed the true capital threshold experiences something structurally different. Not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of the reversal of the fundamental direction. Things may slow. Specific opportunities may not materialize as expected. Particular relationships may not develop as anticipated. But the overall direction of the force, toward him rather than away from him, toward compounding rather than depleting, does not reverse. Because it is not generated by the conditions of the competitive plane. It is generated by the law of the creative plane, which does not oscillate. It compounds. And the man who has built true capital sufficient to access this law has, in the deepest sense of Wattles' teaching, secured himself against the reversals of competitive fortune, not by accumulating more competitive resources, but by building the only capital that the law of creative force recognizes and rewards without condition. The specific quality of relationships that arrive after the threshold is worth examining because it reveals something important about the nature of the true capital as a social and creative force. Before the threshold, the man of developing true capital tends to attract a mixed network. Some people who recognize his creative quality and engage with him at a depth commensurate with it, and others who are attracted by the surface evidence of his competence without engaging at the level of genuine creative force. After the threshold, this mixture resolves. The people who appear in his life with increasing frequency are people who are themselves operating on the creative plane, people who have built their own true capital, who are recognized in their own domains for the quality of their creative surplus delivery, and who are looking not for a transaction, but for a creative peer. These are the people who bring the most significant opportunities, the most generative partnerships, and the most compounding access. And they come not because the man sought them out through competitive positioning, but because the creative force he has built is recognized by the creative force they have built. And this mutual recognition is itself the most durable foundation of any genuinely productive relationship. The threshold, in this sense, is the point at which the man's invisible capital begins to act as a selective magnet, drawing toward him the quality of force that matches his own, and repelling the purely extractive engagements that would have diluted his practice. What the man discovers when he reaches this threshold, and what he knows with absolute certainty, is that Wattles was not describing an aspirational ideal. He was describing a law, a structural feature of the creative plane that operates with perfect consistency for anyone who builds sufficient true capital to access it. The doors that were closed to the competitive man are not closed by circumstance or by the preferences of the people who control them. They are closed by the nature of the currency that was being offered. The man who arrives with true capital, with the accumulated record of consistent, genuine, unconditional creative surplus expressed through a character of genuine inner quality, offers a currency that these doors recognize and respond to. They open not as a reward for good behavior, but as the structural response of a law that has always been operative, is operative now, and will remain operative regardless of market conditions, regardless of the economic era, and regardless of everything else that changes in the perpetual churning of the competitive plane. This is the confirmation that arrives at the threshold. This is what the man recognizes when the direction of force changes. This is the irrefutable evidence of the true capital at critical mass. The outer world becoming, at last, the audible testimony of an invisible account that was always building, always real, and always destined to express as exactly this. Money is a tool. This is not a diminishment of its power. It is the precise specification of its nature. A tool is a means of force directed toward a defined purpose. It is powerful within its range of application and entirely inert outside of it. Money is powerful within the range of the competitive plane. It can capture, it can transact, it can leverage, it can acquire the things that the competitive plane makes available through financial exchange. Within that range, it is an extraordinarily effective instrument. But its range is fixed. The things that lie outside the competitive plane, the genuine loyalty, the crisis trust, the exclusive access, the creative partnership, the compounding reputation, do not respond to it, cannot be obtained through it, and will never yield to it regardless of how skillfully it is deployed or how massively it is accumulated. These things lie in a different jurisdiction, and they are subject to a different law, the law of creative force, governed by the principle of use-value surplus, and expressed through the true capital that is built one act of genuine over-delivery at a time. The true capital is something else entirely. It is not a more sophisticated financial instrument. It is not a longer-term investment strategy. It is a categorically different form of wealth, operating on a different plane, subject to different laws, and commanding access to a different class of acquisitions. Where money is finite, the true capital is expandable without limit, because it is generated by the creative faculty, which grows through use. Where money is external, held outside the man, subject to the conditions of the market and the actions of others, the true capital is in part internal, built into the man himself as a developed creative capacity that nothing external can diminish. Where money competes for a share of existing value, the true capital creates new value from the formless substance of creative possibility. And creation, unlike capture, produces returns that compound in directions and at rates that no competitive calculation can predict or contain. The synthesis of everything in Wattles' teaching on the true capital can be stated with a precision that the length of the exploration has now made possible. The invisible currency is the accumulated creative force of a man who consistently delivers more use value than cash value, built on the foundation of genuine inner quality, expressed through unconditional and consistent surplus delivery, and compounded by the operation of the creative law that returns to the man of genuine creative force. Through trust, through loyalty, through access, through partnership, through reputation, and through the direct response of formless substance to genuine creative thought. Everything that the competitive plane, with all its money and all its leverage, has never and will never be able to purchase. This is not a new idea. It is an ancient law, articulated by Wallace Wattles with a precision and a practical clarity that remain unmatched. And it is available to every man who is willing to understand it, to build the inner formation it requires, and to practice the outer expression it demands. Without exception, without condition, and without requiring the visible return before the next deposit is made. The man who has followed this understanding to its conclusion is now in possession of the complete framework. He knows what the true capital is. He knows how it is built, how it compounds, and what it purchases. He knows why money, for all its genuine power, is the beginning of the economic conversation rather than its culmination. He knows that there is a plane beyond the competitive one, that it operates by laws that are as consistent and reliable as any law in the natural world, and that the man who aligns himself with those laws, who builds the true capital through the patient, unconditional, consistent practice of creative surplus, has secured himself the only form of wealth that compounds without ceiling, survives every market, and purchases what no price tag in the history of commerce has ever been placed on. This is the true capital. This is the invisible currency. This is what Wallace Wattles understood. And this is what he taught with the absolute confidence of a man who had seen the law operate and knew, with the certainty of direct knowledge, that it would never fail. Wallace Wattles arrived at his understanding of the creative plane not through abstract theorizing, but through the systematic study of the nature of wealth and the rigorous observation of how it actually accumulates in the lives of men across history and across circumstance. What he found at the deepest level of that study was a law that the competitive plane had been obscuring for centuries. A law so fundamental and so consistently operative that its invisibility to most men was itself the primary explanation for most men's permanent confinement to the ceiling of competitive wealth. The law is this: the universe is structured to respond to creative force directed generously outward. And the response is always more than what was given, always compounding, always expansive, always operating in alignment with the inexhaustible creative substance that underlies all visible reality. This is not a metaphor. In Wattles' teaching, it is the most literal possible description of how wealth is generated at the deepest level of its source. The man who has understood this law has understood something that most of his contemporaries, regardless of their intelligence and regardless of their financial sophistication, have not understood and cannot understand. That is from within the framework of the competitive plane. He has understood that the question is not how to capture more of the existing supply, but how to generate new value from the formless abundance that the creative plane provides access to. He has understood that generosity, in Wattles' precise sense, the consistent delivery of more use value than cash value, powered by genuine inner quality and genuine creative intention, is not a moral virtue that happens to have economic benefits. It is the precise mechanical operation of the law that generates new value from formless substance. Every act of genuine surplus is, in the deepest sense of Wattles's metaphysics, a creative act in the fullest meaning of that word. The introduction of something into the world that did not exist before the man brought his creative force to bear. And the universe, as Wattles understood it, always responds to genuine creation with a return that compounds beyond the sum of what was created. The man Wattles describes, the advancing man, the man who creates more than he consumes, who gives more than was asked, who leaves every exchange richer than he found it, is not a saint. He is not an idealist operating at the expense of his own interests. He is a man who has understood his own interests with a depth and a precision that the competitive man has never achieved. He knows that his true interests are not served by the extraction of maximum cash value from each individual transaction. They are served by the consistent building of the true capital that will, in time and by the operation of a law, he trusts absolutely, return to him in the form of everything the competitive man has been spending his life trying to force through financial leverage. The advancing man is, in the most precise sense of the term, the rational man. The man who has understood the actual operating laws of wealth and aligned his behavior with them, as opposed to the man who believes himself rational because he maximizes every visible transaction while systematically forfeiting every invisible one. What Wattles offers in the concept of the true capital is not an encouragement to be generous. It is a description of a structural reality. The generous act, the act of genuine surplus, delivered with genuine creative intention, is not admirable because it is costly. It is powerful because it is creative. It brings new value into existence, and new value, introduced into the formless creative substance that Wattles identifies as the underlying reality of all material existence, does not disappear. It compounds. It returns. It manifests in every channel available to the man who created it, through every relationship, every reputation, every partnership, every opportunity, until the visible life of the man is the faithful reflection of the invisible account he has built, and every door and every building opens before him, not because he is lucky, not because he is favored, but because he has built the only currency the most important doors in the world have ever recognized. The master's own voice on this matter is worth hearing with the full weight of everything that preceded it in this analysis. Wattles taught that the man who moves from the competitive to the creative mind, who gives to every man more in use value than he takes in cash value, will find that the money comes to him in abundance. He does not seek it. He creates the conditions under which it cannot avoid him. This statement is not a promise. It is not an aspiration. It is a description of a structural consequence, the inevitable output of a law that has been in operation since long before Wattles named it, and that will remain in operation long after. The man who creates the conditions, by building the true capital through the consistent practice of creative surplus, does not need to pursue the abundance. The abundance pursues him. This is not poetry. It is the most precise description of the creative law's operation in a human life that Wattles ever produced. And it is the statement that renders every other teaching in this analysis complete. The practical implication of this master's truth, translated from principle into the lived reality of a specific day in a specific man's life, is that every exchange, regardless of its apparent scale or significance, is an opportunity to make a deposit into the true capital account. The small transaction, the brief engagement, the apparently minor relationship, None of these are beneath the practice. In fact, the consistent practice of surplus in the small exchanges is the precise discipline that builds the perceptual faculty and the creative habit that express at scale in the large ones. The man who delivers creative surplus only in high-stakes situations and maintains the even exchange in everything else has not built the practice. He has built a performance. And performances, as has already been established, do not generate true capital. The man who builds the practice across every exchange, regardless of scale or visibility, is the man who wakes one day to find that the threshold has been crossed, that the direction of force has changed, and that the creative law has, quietly and inevitably, fulfilled the promise that is not a promise, but a structural guarantee of the most reliable order. The weight of Wattles' teaching, fully received, produces a specific orientation in the man who has genuinely understood it, not excitement, not urgency, not the heightened emotional charge of a man who has heard something that sounds like it might change his life. It produces a quiet, settled resolution, the kind that comes not from inspiration, but from comprehension. The man who truly understands the true capital knows that the path forward is neither complex nor uncertain. It is simply the practice of the creative law, executed with the consistency of a man who trusts a verified principle, built on the foundation of genuine inner quality, and sustained through the patient, unconditional discipline of giving more than was asked, in every exchange, without exception, without visible return required, and without the expiration date that ambition without principle always eventually reaches. This is the Master's truth. Received in full, it does not produce the feeling of a new beginning. It produces the recognition of the only beginning that was ever worth making. Money is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. This is the decree that Wattles' teaching places at the foundation of any serious engagement with the nature of wealth. And it deserves to be heard not as a qualification of money's importance, but as a precise description of its position in the causal architecture of a life of genuine abundance. The man who mistakes money for the end of the conversation has identified the output and mistaken it for the source. He has found the visible expression of the creative law's operation and decided that this expression is the thing itself. That if he can accumulate more of it through force, through leverage, through the maximum extraction the competitive plane permits, he will have arrived at the destination that the creative law describes. He has not. He has arrived at the reflection of a deeper reality, which he has then attempted to manage in place of the reality itself. And the doors that remain closed to him are not closed because his reflection is too small. They are closed because he has been working on the reflection while the source, the true capital, the invisible currency, the one asset that compounds without limit and purchases what money never could, was never built. The man who stops at money stops short of the only capital that compounds without limit. He stops short of the loyalty that chooses to remain when it could leave. He stops short of the trust that holds through crisis rather than dissolving in one. He stops short of the access that is offered not to the highest bidder, but to the man whose character has been tested and recognized. He stops short of the creative partnerships that multiply his force beyond what any individual capacity could produce alone. He stops short of the compounding reputation that precedes him into every room and transforms his reception before he has spoken a word. And he stops short of the inner life that is the direct experience of a man fully aligned with the creative plane. The felt reality of generating rather than extracting, of creating rather than competing, of building the only currency whose supply is determined by the depth of the creative faculty rather than by the constraints of the market. Stopping at money is stopping at the beginning. And the man who has understood everything that was laid before him in this analysis knows, with a settled certainty of a comprehension that has no further need for external confirmation, that the beginning is not where he intends to remain. Build the invisible. This is the instruction, not as a motivational directive, as a practical and precise command drawn from the creative law itself. Build the invisible by doing what Wattles describes. Give more in use value than you take in cash value in every exchange, with every person, across every scale of engagement, powered by the genuine inner quality that James Allen's teaching demands as the prerequisite. Do this consistently. Do this unconditionally. Do this without requiring the visible return before the next deposit is made. Do this through the period of invisible accumulation when the competitive world offers no confirmation and the ledger shows no entry. Do this until the compounding reaches critical mass. Do this until the threshold is crossed and the direction of force changes and the opportunities begin arriving from directions you never targeted and the doors open in rooms you never knocked on. Build the invisible, and the visible will follow. Not as a hope, not as an aspiration, but as the structural consequence of a law that was operative before you were born, and that will remain operative after every market you have ever known has been replaced by one you would not recognize. Spend it generously. This instruction follows the first and cannot be separated from it. The true capital is not a static asset to be hoarded and protected, as the competitive man hoards and protects his financial reserves. It is a living, creative force, and living forces are sustained by expression, not by containment. Every act of genuine surplus spending, every deployment of accumulated trust, creative reputation, an established relationship in the genuine service of another person, is not a reduction of the account. It is a reinforcement of it, a deepening of it, and a multiplication of it. Through the creative law that returns more than was given to every genuine act of creative force directed outward into the world. Spend the invisible currency in the only way it was designed to be spent, by continuing to build it through the consistent, unconditional, genuine practice of giving more than was asked and more than was expected in every exchange that your life presents for the duration of your life's full creative force. Write in the comments, beyond money. This is not a ritual of engagement metrics. It is a statement of position, a declaration made in the visible world that you have understood where money sits in the causal architecture of genuine wealth and where the true capital sits above it. It is the beginning of an accountability, the record of the moment at which the comprehension was received and the practice was accepted, not as a new strategy to be tried and discarded, but as the operational law of a life that has chosen the creative plane over the competitive one. Write it, and mean it in the specific way that Wattles' teaching makes possible, as the recognition that beyond money lies the only capital that has ever purchased what actually matters, and that the building of it begins with the next exchange, in the next moment, with the next person who enters your sphere of creative force. Begin accumulating the currency that actually changes everything. Not tomorrow, not when the conditions are better or the stakes are higher or the right opportunity presents itself to begin the practice properly. In the next exchange you have with another human being, whatever scale, whatever context, whatever apparent significance. Begin. Ask the question that opens the creative plane. What more than this exchange requires can I bring to this person's genuine benefit? And bring it, without calculation of return, without measurement of immediate effect, without the impatience of the competitive mind that requires visible confirmation before the next act of surplus can be justified. Bring the surplus. Trust the law. Build the invisible. And know, with the quiet certainty of a man who has received the teaching of one of the most rigorous students of wealth's creative source who ever studied the matter, that the true capital is already compounding, that the threshold is already in the future rather than the past, and that everything the competitive plane's money has never reached is already being purchased, invisibly, in every genuine act of creative force directed outward from the plane on which you have now chosen to operate.